Hello, good evening. I'd like to thank Aware for asking me to speak and Joan for her very kind introduction, and to you all for coming this evening. I'm going to talk about two or three things. I'm going to start with a little bit about the stress vulnerability hypothesis in health generally and as it applies to mental health. And then I'm going to spend time talking about mental health rather than mental illness and positive mental health, and how all that fits in to the ideas we have around recovery, and how that's very much a part of the focus and the drive that we have now within our mental health services generally. So I'm going to start with a tree. It's often a good place to start. And I just want to contrast this with, many of us will be familiar with some of the older ideas, particularly about affective disorders or about depression. And we know about the distinctions between endogenous depression, sometimes also called melancholic depression, or in contrast, reactive depression. And these were concepts that were used quite a bit up until recent years. And we use them less often now. And there is value in that way of thinking about things, but one of the central difficulties with an approach like that is that it's too neat and it's too clear about the distinctions. And for most people, it isn't that clear. There are several different factors involved, not just one or two factors in deciding whether it's one form of depression or another. And a lot of these ideas have started to emerge, and they come from health generally and have really taken hold in mental health. And the thinking behind them is, and I know many of you will be familiar with this, is that many of us have a vulnerability to develop a particular illness or disease. It doesn't mean we're going to develop that, but it means that our risk is increased. For the vast majority of things that we have to deal with, whether it's that in mental health or physical health, we have very few conditions that are purely genetic. And the vast majority have some sort of a contribution, which might be genetic or something in our past. But there's a very significant contribution from our environment, what's happening around us and what's happening in the recent past and currently. And a way of thinking about this is the vulnerability that we have, we often don't know about it. You know, if we look around the lecture hall this evening, and you know, we all have different vulnerabilities to something like heart disease, and we often don't know about that. We might have some idea from maybe something to do with our family history, but as we know with most things, having a family history doesn't mean that I'm going to develop a particular symptoms or illness. But what a vulnerability suggests is something that we might not know about, and a good way to look at it, I think, is about this tree. We always hear about trees. We only see the part of the tree that's above the ground, and just as important to the tree as the leaves are the roots of the tree there, and they're often roughly the same size as the tree. So a vulnerability in a particular tree might look something like this. Might look that the root system is slightly smaller than in other trees. Now that tree could, is likely to still prosper and do well. But if you add in other things which we consider stresses or stressors nowadays, you see how that might make things more difficult. So let's imagine if that tree was in a place where, I know it's not very likely here apart from a few recent weeks where you might have a drought you didn't quite get to, but that would be an environmental stress. Or if the tree was in a place where the soil was very poor in nutrients, and you could see that as something that might add in some way to the vulnerability. And again, this tree is the same in the previous slides. The point about this being is that in difficult or stressful circumstances, for example, in a storm, that tree is more vulnerable to getting damaged, even if that's to be temporary damage. So that's the way that we tend to think in lots of different areas of medicine now, and also in mental health. To go back to this is a place in North Connemara, which I'll come back to later. But it looks lovely on that day. That might be 4 or 5 days a year. It's like that. The rest of the time it can be considerably wetter and colder and windier. But in the first instance, to look at the trees there, it's a relatively harsh environment. It's quite rocky, and they're obviously doing quite well, quite a lot of them. And you can see the circumstances there, that it's very close to a lake, and having plenty of water isn't a difficulty there usually. And also about where they are. There, if I were to tell you where that is, the mountains there are to the north and the west. So that's a considerable amount of shelter for a tree to have there. And also, there are many of them in the same place. So there's strength in the sort of support that different trees have there. So that's just a concept to think about. And before we come on to mental health, it might be useful just to go back to that idea around to do with health generally, and about heart disease and how we think about heart disease. Because this sort of work and this sort of way of thinking started earlier, and it goes back a few decades. And there isn't much debate nowadays about various risk factors. There's pretty good agreement about the risk factors for heart disease. One of the top ones here is, pretty much all of us know that if we're smokers, we know that it increases our risk to disease generally and to heart disease. Diabetes, we know as well, is something associated with Western and industrialized diets, that increases our risk. It's significant as well because a lot of the treatments that we have, particularly the newer treatments in various areas of mental health, can increase the risk of diabetes as well. So you see how that links in with risk between physical and mental health. High blood pressure. This is something that increases risk of heart disease, and it's intimately linked to stress. So stress that we're under can increase blood pressure and accordingly increases our risk of physical ill health. Cholesterol is something we're much better at now checking about. We know that's a risk factor, and it can be monitored quite easily. Physical inactivity. This is something that, if you look back over a few generations, our lifestyles have changed considerably over a short period of time. That many of us have gone from having quite active outdoor days to quite sedentary days, and that has significant impact on us as a heart disease risk factor. An unhealthy diet. This is something we'll come to later. We've had a profound change. The observations about this, that in the last few decades we've had more change to what we eat than we have for the preceding 10 or hundreds of thousands of years. We went from a stage where everybody knew where their food was grown, or if it was meat, where the animals came from, to now where we get it from a supermarket and we take it on faith. So there's a considerable overlap, so I wanted to show here the risk factors for depression. We focus a lot nowadays on identifying what are sources of stress. And we often talk about stress generally in this way. And I think one of the key points for me about this is the difference in the way that stress affects people. There's a key point here in that what might be very stressful for one person might not be stressful at all. So there's no generic way to look at how stress affects us all. The most important thing for any of us is to know what causes us the greatest stress. And sometimes that takes a bit of thinking about to see where the pattern might be, either now and in the past, and how that has affected us. And the step beyond that is, if we are under severe stress, or if a stress is prolonged, about the effect it has on us. So what are the early warning signs of how it might be affecting us? And this, a very common early warning sign for many people who might be developing symptoms of depression is something like a subtle change in sleep disturbance, maybe difficulty getting to sleep at night or waking up early in the morning. So that's a key part of that, about how we need to think about that. The other factors, there's considerable crossover with our physical health. Poor diet. Up until recently, we didn't really think about that very much, did we, to do with our mental health. If you think about a lot of the treatments that we have, for depression, a lot of medications, for example, work on neurotransmitter systems such as serotonin and noradrenaline, norepinephrine, that we all know about. And when you think about it, all of those neurotransmitters are ultimately, they're made from our food. They're made from what we eat. They're the building blocks of everything that we have in our bodies. So it makes sense how diet is probably more important than we used to realize. The other things are, it makes sense when you think about how a poor diet might affect our concentration, our energy levels, and how that has a cumulative effect in making symptoms of depression worse if our diet is poor. Physical inactivity, again back to this, I just mentioned what we talked about in the last slide in that crossover. Poor sleep, a critical component for most of us in both an early warning sign and also something that for any of us, we all know about the consequences of particularly severe sleep deprivation. It can have profound effects on our well-being and our mood, and that's why stress there is important. Relaxation skills, these are, sometimes it's not really fair to say that relaxation skills are impaired, because if any of us are in a very stressful situation, it's much harder to use those skills. It's much harder to get started with them. So they're the sort of things that need to be practiced, or maybe need to be built on so that they're effective in those situations. And impaired thinking skills, and a lot of this, which I'll mention later, is to do with the work that has come through about CBT in depression and anxiety disorders, cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's very good evidence about that about the effectiveness there, and improving those sort of thinking skills that make us more resilient in the face of stressful situations and depression. Social isolation. I think we'd all recognize again that we've had a lot of change over recent generations, where a lot of us are in situations where we would have been in a place, for example, if we were living in rural communities where you had very strong links with neighbours in your local community, and there was lots of help available when there were difficulties. And as more and more of us have moved away from those areas, and more of us live in urban settings, those sort of links it's harder to keep them, and you have to do more work in an urban environment to keep them, and that's through making an effort to keep links with people. So social isolation, particularly in urban areas, is more common and is a risk factor for depression. Meaningful activity. I often think that phrase on its own, it doesn't carry a lot of meaning, and you always have to talk about it. People used to talk about work, that was important, but the more research that was done on it, it's not the actual work that's important. Lots of people do work which they might spend 9 to 5 time doing work that they don't find particularly rewarding, but they might need to do it for other reasons. They may do that, and yet in the evenings do voluntary work or do work within their communities that they find incredibly rewarding. And that can be much more meaningful to the person than the work they're doing the day. So it's that sort of meaningful work of often boiled down to work that you feel that you're making a difference. You're making a difference to other people's lives, and that can be very helpful in being protective in reducing the impact of depression risk factors. Okay, stressful situations. How do we go about identifying them? We're all different, and I think one of the things, an example something to do with work is there are some of us who are in situations where we like things to be very organized and very predictable, and it's often to do with the sort of people that we are, and we manage that very well, and we do that very well. There are other people who would actually find that very stressful, and they want something to be unpredictable, and they want things to be changing from day to day. So what's stressful for one person is not stressful for another, and the key thing is what's stressful for you. So there can be no absolute way of saying what the most stressful situation for you would be. It's to think about what has been difficult in the past, see is there any pattern to that, and then the other thing is to be aware of the what stress causes within ourselves and what we might notice at the time. We often underestimate or ignore the signs of stress when we're experiencing them, and they include a few different areas. One is about the physical signs of being under stress. When you think about this, sometimes it can be the case that you might put it down to other things other than being under stress. But if that's combined with something like those emotional signs about just feeling that you're completely overwhelmed, you might have been able to manage a significant amount of stress, but it just gets to a certain point, you feel overwhelmed by it and have difficulties in finding a way through to manage it. Other common signs. Again, this fits in with being stressed and feeling depressed at the time. When things become so difficult or you feel so stressed, and hopelessness is about this, that sense of, I don't feel able to control this, this is not going to get better, this is going to continue to be this difficult. And that can fit in with not being able to, the sort of things that we talked about getting a lot from your links with other people and from friendships and family, that suddenly that becomes a lot more lifeless, and you just get this feeling back from other people and you feel yourself that you're not appreciated in the way that you were. And commonly this can be quite subtle to begin with. It's feeling irritable, or you're finding that you're more argumentative. So, if any of us can have these at, maybe one or two of these, but if you're getting 3 or 4 in all these different domains, that's a relatively reliable way of indicating that you are under significant stress. Okay, the next thing is what to do about that. How should we approach it? The first thing is to decide what's causing the stress, and I can say that there in 3 words, but that's often quite difficult to do. There's a common pattern here that we can identify some things that we can predict are going to cause us stress, but we often underestimate the impact of positive things in our lives that are stressful, and these are the things that we have to be careful about. So an example I've often heard from people is around, you might be looking forward to something, a family event. Could be a wedding within the family, which is something you're looking forward to, which is very positive. But you might have significant responsibilities being involved for the preparation for that. You might have a lot of work to do. So in that situation, the problem isn't that the wedding is coming up. The problem is that you just have too much work to do, and it's too stressful. So once you've decided what the problem is, the next thing to do is to think about what you might do about it. And a goal, we think about managing stress because it's absolutely unrealistic for any of us to eliminate stress or go through life without stress, because it's part of what we have to deal with all the time. But we want it to be manageable, and we want to be able to use it productively to do things. So a goal, what might be, you set a goal about what to do. Well, one option there, if you were feeling completely overwhelmed by a wedding or something like that, the first thing that might cross your mind in a really difficult situation is, I'm just not going. And that might take away a lot of the stress and anxiety about it. But a better goal, if you came up with it yourself, might be, I've identified what's causing the problem, I've identified it's the excessive workload, and I'm going to try and cut that in half. So that might be your goal. And if you make that your goal, how are you going to do it? Are there ways to Are there ways to achieve that? There are lots of different ways to approach that, about how you might seek help from somebody that you think would be helpful, and there are lots of other ways to. Sorry about that. Parts of the podium just collapsing there. Fine. To think of various different solutions, and the key point here is that there's generally always more than one solution. It's just a question of thinking about it enough so that you have more than one to think about what might be the best one for you in a given situation. Anybody use pros and cons lists? Pros and cons list is something that it's come up a little bit in motivational interviews, which is about any choice or any decision that we make, or if we're thinking about a solution to implement. Most solutions that we have, there are pros, but there are also some cons to it, aren't there? So there are advantages to us and there are potential disadvantages. So if I manage to get help to prepare and help me do this work for a wedding, what might the cons be? It might be a situation where you feel that things wouldn't be done properly, or you feel maybe you don't know, you're worried that it mightn't be done properly and that might let people down on the day. So that there's some anxiety there that would need to be managed. But the key thing to a pros and cons list is the pros should outweigh the cons. Any sort of good solution, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And when you think about it, it doesn't seem particularly complicated, but it is the advantage of being able to write all that down. And you might write it down in 2 columns and look about it and think about it and maybe discuss it with someone. You pick the solution that you think is going to work best. And once you've picked the solution, it's a problem-solving approach. You need to set a period of time and see how it's going. If you've got a month to go, you're trying to make a change which you expect to be helpful. You might look at it again in a week or a fortnight. Maybe it could be improved, or maybe you'll do something different. It's a way of keeping things under control, keeping you in control of the situation. Because one of the things that's most difficult about a very stressful situation is that lack of control you feel over it. And everything's happening around you and to you. And the more you can get back in control of this, the better the results you tend to get. Okay, right the way when we've been doing that, when you've been looking at identifying and managing stress, we should be doing this all the time. Anybody know about this? Have you heard about that from the HSE campaign? It's gone quiet now. It was a few years ago. What they were trying to do again was, again, use some of the concepts that come from physical health. So do you remember, if you go back, some of you will be remember the way that I remember. Do you remember those RTE in the 70s, the aerobic fitness ads, about encouraging us all to get out on our bikes and do various things? That was a way about focusing on physical health as a positive. And this is some of the things that we're trying to do now in mental health. So rather than focus on illness and pathology, that we should be focusing very much on positive things to do with mental health that will make us all more resilient in the face of stress or difficulty or symptoms of depression. And there are common themes here that we should be looking at. Back to this idea of the healthy thinking skills, which I'm going to go through a bit more detail now. The relaxation skills, sleep, regular exercise, and eating well. And there's a huge crossover here. In other words, I'm not making any distinction between mental and physical health. I'm looking at them in a combined way there. So healthy thinking skills. Have most of you heard about these? These are concepts from CBT, and they're thinking patterns, or what are called thinking traps in CBT for depression. That when any of us become depressed, we tend to our thoughts tend to go in a particular way. And overgeneralization is a process that involves you pick out some bad things that happen and you generalize them to everything else. So you start to think about everything in a very negative way. And you can see how being depressed can make you more likely to think like this, and that indeed can make the depression worse. The point of identifying these is because there are psychological approaches that it's almost like a form of mental fitness for that, about there are skills and techniques that are helpful in managing that. Filtering means really when if I'm getting news and people are telling me about things, that's a sense of filtering out anything good and only having the bad and the bad news get to me. So that's a sort of a thing about a sense of perspective going as a form of a thinking skill that isn't helpful. All or nothing. That's about having very all or nothing standards for ourselves. So assuming and believing that we have to do things perfectly or we're a failure. It's all or nothing. Whereas for most of us, it's somewhere in between all the time. But that's the sort of, and that sort of thinking like that makes it very difficult in stressful situations to manage with that. And catastrophization. I put that word in just to see how tongue-tied I get and just to check how anxious I am when I'm giving talks, but I did okay there. So this is a thing about, in our day, if maybe one thing or two bad things happen, that it signifies to us that, things are disastrous and nothing good is going to happen, and that's going to lead to something else worse and something else worse, and it's a very negative thinking. And I think traps are a good word because you can get caught in them repeatedly, and there's considerable work that can be done to improve that. Relaxation skills. Do you see a lot of focus on this in recent years around various new ways of relaxation skills? Some of the practitioners don't particularly like to have them all called relaxation skills, and they're not, but it's a convenient way to group them. Most of us know about breathing exercises. These are something that we've had for a long time. They go back to the the 60s and 70s in mental health settings. What does it do? I mean, what does it achieve? It's a way, at times when we're depressed or anxious, it's a way of pulling us back into the present. Because a lot of, when we're depressed, we find that a lot of our time is spent going back to the things that have gone wrong in the past and worrying about how things might go wrong in the future. And anxiety does the same thing. And a lot of exercises like this are ways to try to bring us back into the present and away from worrying about the past, which we can't change now, and not spending too much time worrying about the future, which we have a limited ability to control. I mean, what we have is, what we're here in the present, and it's a way of bringing us back to that. And mindfulness is a form of this. Has anybody here got experience in mindfulness? Yeah, and it's becoming much more widely available, and in general, you get very positive feedback from it. Mindfulness is an approach that comes originally from Buddhism, and there's been considerable work in the US in the last 20 years about applying it in mental health and general hospital settings, and it's been shown to be very effective in a wide range of areas. As most of you who've had experience with mindfulness, it's a very simple concept that can be very hard to do. So, it's meant to bring us into the present moment, but being what we're like as people, we have all sorts of other thoughts crossing our minds all the time and thinking what we might do tomorrow, what we do later, what happened yesterday. So it takes a long time to learn that, to make good use of it. And there are some people, and some of us find that it's just too still a way of doing it. There are some people who are quite active people, and they like to be able to combine an approach like that with something physical or exercise. That's why yoga can use a lot of this, but you can be active in the middle of it. And Tai Chi is another example like this, where you can use relaxation skills with physical activity. Exercise often isn't particularly relaxing at the time, but can be very effective afterwards if you've used exercise, and that can be very helpful and relaxing. Creativity, writing, music. I work with several people who would be very clear about describing their gardening as well as a creative activity, and that is very helpful in managing stressful situations. Getting enough sleep. Better sleep means better mental health. Most of us would agree with that. Isn't that right? It's circular to some extent. Better mental health gives us better sleep. So this comes back to the importance of getting our sleep right. And the importance of that is around a routine and structure for us. I mean, other simple things like avoiding tea and coffee in the evenings and making sure we're getting exercise, and the importance of a wind down routine, which might involve reading for lots of people. That can have hugely positive implications for one's mental health and for managing stress. Medication. We'd have to put our hands up about this here, that we have, I think, hospitals and mental health services in general have contributed a lot to problems here rather than solutions. If you think what used to be the practice for any of us, if, for example, we were admitted to hospital, and if we were admitted to hospital for physical health or mental health, it was almost routine to do what? Prescribe a sleeping tablet. So in other words, if we were, a much better explanation that it's quite stressful if you've been sick, if you've been admitted to hospital, you're away from your home, and it might be expected that your sleep would be affected. So the solution is not to start on a sleeping tablet that we know now are very addictive. So we're trying to do a lot of work on doing a lot of that and making sure that nowadays that problem isn't introduced. Again, some of our medications that are used, it's very commonly described that a person has the experience that the medication is making you feel tired during the day. And when you're tired during the day, you have that sense of it not sleeping properly at night, and it's affecting your sleep. And the other thing about medication at night is that just not leading to you might be sleeping through the night, but not getting a good quality sleep. So you don't feel refreshed during the day. So that's important to look at all of that. Substances, most important for us is, the most common one is what in this country? Alcohol, yeah. So alcohol, and the difficulty with some of these things like the medication is they can be very effective. Alcohol can be very effective in the short term at reducing anxiety. It can be very helpful at getting to sleep, but it disrupts the quality of our sleep and leaves us feeling less rested the next day. So it's a short-term solution that isn't effective in the medium or long term. Regular exercise. These are all the advantages. I'm not going to go into those in detail. I think anybody can disagree there if you think there's anything there that doesn't apply. So the obvious question then is, why are so many of us so bad at taking regular exercise? I think that it often applies, first of all, if you haven't been taking exercise for many years, that in itself, about just starting over a week or two, can give somebody a very good sense of achievement from that. Or it might be the form of exercise that you're taking. You could start a form of exercise that involved learning a skill. And we can all do that at any stage in our life, so that can be a very positive experience. Why don't we do it? Partly because of how it's described as regular exercise. It's a good thing, we should all be out exercising, and we all agree it's a good thing, but we don't see it as enjoyable anymore. If you think back when lots of us, when we were children, we didn't go out kicking football around for a few hours because it was a good thing to do. We did it because we enjoyed it. And we lose that sense as we get older about exercise being something that we enjoy doing. So that's what's important there, is that you don't feel that you just have to do one thing, or there's one thing right for every person, that I should take up running or I should take up cycling or swimming. I mean, there's something that you might be far more likely to enjoy than somebody else, and then that may be the thing to try for you. Useful. I think this is to do with trying to build exercise into your day. Lots of us are really busy all day, we're busy in the evening with things to do, but you could build exercise into get into work or get into your studies. So if I'm going to be traveling anyway, I'm going to be in the car, or if I'm traveling by train or by bus, I might get off early and walk. I might start walking for 15 minutes or 20 minutes and build that up. And that's, is something that may well be helpful during the day and rewarding. Possible as well, something you need to be able to do. It's if you have a very busy evening, lots of commitments to other people, maybe at home, to children or relatives, it may not be a good time for you to be trying to do these things in the evening, and you may have to build it in during the day. And the confident and capable comes back to taking up things later in life. I'm sort of a late developer swimmer, and it was worth doing. I think it's Ricky Gervais or something that says that when a person gets to 30 or 35, you're more likely to be able to walk into a room when the television's too high and say, "Do you mind turning that down?" You get more confidence to admit the things that you're not good at, and they're worth doing. It should be a break from pressure for us. It should be something different from what we're doing during the day. So that can be a good way to look at it. And the social activity. Has anybody here ever been involved in any walking groups? Yeah. And there is very good evidence of the effectiveness of walking groups in being helpful in managing depression, managing anxiety. And when you think about it, it's an aerobic form of exercise. It's something that most of us can do. You walk with other people. It's social. You get those. So there are a lot of benefits in it. And it's becoming much more widely available and recommended. And the last bit is about eating, because I want to get through this because I think we underestimated lots. And there's an American writer, has anybody heard of Michael Pollan? He's a science writer initially, and he's written a lot in recent years about one of the things that's been difficult for us about our health generally is all to do with industrialized or processed food. So we've over recent decades, we're bombarded with all of this. And his solution, now these solutions are, I think I think you're not meant to take them all completely seriously, but there's something to think about in all of them. His solution is, what might you think? Just eat food. But he goes on to explain what that's about. Food is something that has grown in the ground, or it walks on, or maybe flies in the ground. Anything that comes out of a factory isn't food. So they're the definition that he's working with. And I think there's something in that. Cook. If we can get around to doing that, it makes us more aware of what we're actually cooking, and that doesn't include ready meals or something like that. It brings us into other things about, if you talk about back to the mindfulness, there are people who, the cooking is a form of meditation. I can't quite achieve that myself, but you can see about when you're doing a physical activity that's pleasurable, you're touching things and you're involved in something like that, and it takes you away from other stresses and pressures. Anybody know what that's about? My first job was in a supermarket, and I won't name the supermarket, but this was completely over my head at the time. I never noticed it. But what this is about is supermarkets are very efficient in the way that they're organized and designed. And what they do is they put all the processed food that doesn't go off in the middle of the supermarket, and all the stuff that's going to go off that they have to replenish regularly, they put all around the edges. So it's less work and effort and money for them to do that. So the next time you go in, you'll see that all the fruit and the veg is around the side, as all the meat and everything else in the middle. So that's kind of a simple rule to try to stay out of the middle of the supermarket. We won't go as far as trying to stay out of the supermarket altogether. Yeah. Eat foods that will go off. That's another good rule to have. Yeah. So before they go off, obviously. Yeah. There's one exception to that, which is it had to be pointed out to me. I couldn't think of it. Cheese is one. Yeah, it's one. Honey's another good one. Apparently, honey will keep for a long time if you keep it for many years. And cheese gets better, so that's even. Yeah. And meals, eat meals as well. This is about we're under pressure all the time not to do this. You know, we're busy. We have other things to organise. People are doing things in the evenings, but being able to have a meal and planning a meal is important, and at a table. And the last bit about this is slowly. We could do those three things at the end, because this isn't then just about the food. It's a lot of the other things we've been talking about earlier happening here, and they're not happening in a way that's work. It's about being able to talk about things that might have been generating stress, some things that are positive, good things. All of that happening in a very informal way. And that's it in general. And I think it's a bit better than. Do you remember I think it's still technically what we use here. Do you know the food pyramid? Yeah. And the food pyramid has it's a pyramid or a triangle with the foods that we should be eating more of at the bottom, and then it gets narrower to the top, the ones less often. The big problem for most of us with that is it's just too complicated. When you look at it, the image, trying to follow it all. And there's been, I think, a good development in the last few years that from the US, and Michelle Obama has been very much involved in trying to promote it. And it's meant to be simple, so we can do about it, and we can do it and think about it all the time. And it fits in with some of these ideas here on this slide. Anybody heard of My Plate? That's it. Every meal that we have, half our plate should be fruit and vegetables. And that's hard for us because we don't think like that. We think, most of us who aren't vegetarians think about the meat, and the other bits are just added on. But whole grains there. So that's it's something it's not difficult to do, and over time it would be a significant positive for most people. I expect we'll probably see it promoted here fairly soon, I'd imagine. Yeah. So just to summarize, the key points being identify stressful situations, manage them, have your own plan about this, and all the time that you're doing this, not to lose sight of looking after your health. And I'm not saying mental health there, I'm just saying health, both mental and physical health. And the point of all of this fits in with recovery. And recovery is to do, back to this slide, and the point of having good health, not being under stress, is something like this. This is what I'd call it a mountain, but then I'm biased. Most people who are from outside Ireland don't consider that a mountain. And lots of people from Kerry wouldn't consider it a mountain, So, but in Connemara it is. But one of the things about it is that you can go there. You do have to prepare for it. The weather can be changeable. You do have to have walking boots. You do have to have rain gear. You have to have a map and a compass. But if you've got all of those things and you've planned about it, and you planned about how you're going to get home, in 4 or 5 hours, very well spent to do that. And it's still the case, although the country is changing a lot, that we don't have to go one particular way that's safe. It's a quilter forest at the bottom there, and you can decide which way you want to walk up. And it's worth doing, and you can decide whether your destination will be on the left there, or the right, or the middle somewhere. And that's how I think about recovery and what we've been talking about today. So that's it.